welcome to Woke Free Christianity. My name is Jason Legg, and this is the great, very Reverend Emery Kazi. Very Reverend.
Yes, because I take those things very seriously.
Emery Kazi. So, what are we talking about today, Emery?
Today, we're going to talk about critical gender theory.
Oh, wow.
Otherwise known as feminism. So this is the part of the woke pantheon that I was most afraid to tackle. So I thought, let's get it off of the way.
Did you get permission from your wife first?
Yeah, I don't need permission.
Oh!
I'm joking. She's not going to listen to this. I also wear my Bulldog Hawaii shirt because I like it. Everyone likes Bulldogs and Hawaii, so I won't be in as much trouble, right? But yeah, no, it's probably going to be controversial for some people to hear what we're going to talk about. But I'm not the one breaking ice here. I mean, obviously, there's other people that are noting the cultural damage done by this, and it is pretty pronounced. And again, my purpose here is to not just get in there and kind of slam something. It is to compare it to the Christian message, because there is truisms in all of these things. And Christianity, by the way, has not treated, let's get this out of the way right away. Christianity has not treated women well, historically. That is true. It's just a fact. I don't think they've taken the whole text seriously. Obviously, there's better and there's worse times in its history, but let's get that right out of the way, that there's a reason there's a reaction, right? And I'm talking about within Christianity. Obviously, culturally, there's been realities, but what has happened is the reaction. J.I. Packer used to say, the reaction is never good. Okay, what he meant by that is, yes, you find something wrong, but then it's the reaction that does as much damage as the original error. So I'll be speaking against things, but with sympathy to why they got there and why people have embraced them. And I'm particularly able to speak on this subject, and I'll tell you why. When I was in university, I took psychology back in the 90s in UVic, and this is when I first ran into it. Okay, so, and I had to take I don't think it was called gender studies at that time. Maybe it was. And it was the first time that there was one paper, and turn this off for the kids, because this was the title of the paper. Was,
fair warning here, yeah.
Why having a penis creates aggression. That was one of the papers.
Wow.
So
sorry about that, by the way. Yeah. Sorry for having that.
So yeah, you should be. And I thought it was bizarre, but back then, there was a group of females who really embraced it on campus, but it had not hit mainstream at all. In my time when I went to seminary at Regent, I was able to study under Ian Provan, who talked about the hermeneutic of feminist thought, which is looking at critical race theory from a biblical perspective, and it was valuable, unbelievable. Then I went off to do my Presbyterian studies at Vancouver School of Theology, and my Christology professor called herself a radical feminist. In fact, she ended her class by saying we can't worship Jesus because he's a man.
Yikes.
Yeah. So that shows you, and there was other feminists on there. So I ended up having to read a lot of stuff, which gave me, I think, a pretty good idea of what this is, more even than the critical race stuff. And my experience has been that it has done incredible damage within the church. Now, the pastor's speaking here. So critical gender theory and feminism, I don't want to use the word feminism, and I'll tell you why. It's the same reason I don't like using the word evangelist. I'm I'm evangelical or something like that, right? Because that word means so many things in different contexts. What I will say is that the critical gender theory that promotes contemporary feminism, which you will see on campuses, and it obviously hit the mainstream, is based again on the idea that there is a continuous conflict. And I'm going back to Marx here, okay? Well, let's go back to Rousseau. Rousseau created the idea that what was in us is absolute truth, that the external the external things that we have in culture, they prohibit us from being our authentic selves. That's where that began. We have these things, whether it's gender role, sexuality, economics, anything, that are pushed on us, and we have to accept them, but they don't allow for the savage, which is what he talked about. Like, the savage is the perfect for him, because that's the person that's least dominated by culture. So Rousseau begins this kind of thinking. Marx takes it's an economic argument. Again, it isn't about women and men. Marx did not have a high view of the traditional family. He thought it would stop the awakening. There's where that word woke comes from, of the proletariat, the working class. But his purpose wasn't because he was trying to raise up women, per se, but rather to create this utopic world economically, and the traditional family is part of the bourgeoisie keeping things down. And there's a whole bunch of reasons I can't get into.
What's the bourgeoisie again?
That's the landowners, right? So this is an economic industrial revolution time. Very simple in some ways, very complex in others. So contemporary feminism definitely has been influenced by this idea that the true self is within ourselves, and that the outside has, pressured it, and you can't find your true self. And that, of course, in their dichotomy, the proletariat is women, the oppressed, and the male-dominated society. And you hear misogyny thrown about. That's the contemporary word for the bourgeoisie. Okay, and these are in constant conflict. And when the bourgeoisie puts things into place, like a traditional family, even like they'll say marriage is you'll hear some of them say marriage is an act of dominance by the culture because it keeps women down. You've heard those kind of things. That's a very neo-Marxist kind of way of looking at the world. It's a view that my authentic self is oppressed by being in this relationship. Mm-hmm. And so this has led, of course, to this whole understanding that to be free is to be in conflict and revolutionary. So you will notice with a lot of feminists, they will color their hair, they'll dress differently. That's all a statement that we're not, it isn't just out of the blue. This is all part of, I'm going to break the mold, right? I'm not going to fit the grid. Now, I don't know, it's become so popularized that I don't know if all of the people getting their hair dyed different colors and putting nose rings and stuff, but all of that is an expression of this understanding that there's a true self underneath that. And in finding that true self, you end up in this this utopia, like that's the kind of the idea, is that there's this genuine feminism out there, femininity that is being oppressed by men. We deserve to get our rights back, and we got to find that.
Just in this started with Rousseau, this ideology or this train of thought. Wasn't he quite the womanizer back in the day?
He was. I think he was.
Was he?
He was. I know Marx liked to have a fling or two.
Did he? Was it? Okay.
But Nietzsche's your guy. If you want to have Nietzsche's the guy that really liked to mess around because he didn't believe in any standards except power.
Okay, maybe I got Rousseau.
And definitely feminists like Nietzsche, because Nietzsche was the guy who kind of says it's all about power. Go get your power. There's no right or wrong because there's no God, right? Yeah. So Marx had he was more of an idealist. He believed in right and wrong in some way, but it was all based on economics and oppression. So they're a mix. They're a real mix of Nietzsche and his children, Derrida, Foucault. These postmodern thinkers have influenced them. And of course the feminists, there's lots of feminist thinkers. And like everything, it influences the church more than often the church influenced it. And people began this process. Now, as you know, one of the reasons it became popularized in the church was for years, and this is not the time to discuss this, women weren't allowed in ministry. So that's how it kind of found its way in. See, the church was the oppressor. You can see how that became, and it had to be overcome so women could get into ministry. Now, obviously, anybody who paid attention knew that women were always doing ministry back then. They had missionary societies and stuff, but they weren't formalized. They weren't in positions. And as you know, I struggle with the fact that church did that because of my theology, and I'll talk about that later. Not because of obviously radical gender theory, So what happens is you end up with a church, and you've got this, they're emphasizing the traditional family, which, by the way, in the first century, it wasn't a traditional family like we think today. Women didn't stay home. They had to work. Everyone worked. It's really a modern post-industrial reality that women could even have free time and all of that. And of course, a lot of things changed. I'm just saying it's not just philosophies. They use these philosophies, but the pill hugely changed the sexual freedom, if I can use that, for females, because there wasn't the same consequence. And of course, the rise of abortion. You just have to realize these things really affected where we are today. These things are come alongside the ideas of feminist thought, and you end up with this new kind of conflict that's perpetual. And if you've run into feminists, as I have, they're not a very happy bunch. That has been my experience, and I'm being honest. I said I'd be honest on here. I don't know one that I can say, oh, that was a nice interaction, because I'm the bad guy, right? So anything, I'm sure there are people right now.
You're kind of the stereotypical bad guy.
White and male, right?
Christian.
Yeah, Christian. I don't fit. I've got a lot of strikes against me. If there's intersectionality, I'm the bad people. Intersectionality.
You get to identify as a bulldog, though.
Yeah,
just
that's right. My female bulldogs like me. Of course, I dominate them. Anyway, the truth is, they're just like critical race theory. You have to live in a constant conflict. That's the problem, because your world is, God's gone out of the picture, and so you end up with this conflict with, and that's why, by the way, there's a lot of females who are being turned off by it right now.
Turned off by what?
By this contemporary feminism. Like, if you ask a lot of females, and statistically, I mean, I think I read an article recently where like 90% of English women do not like to call themselves feminists because of what's going on. But you do find it in the church, and I'll give you some examples. What's happened is women have got into the ministry, but often they have been trained, like through that seminary, in critical race theory. So they come in with an edge right away. And I feel
Jesus was a man, that example.
Yeah, that is an example. That's an extreme example. Okay. But the teaching was that this is constant conflict. And sin changes in this, right? So there's still sin, but sin is power, right? So women being that, and you have to understand this, is where things start to go off the rails. Women being that they're constantly in the proletariat role, in the oppressed role, can't be sinners, because sin is power. They don't have power. You understand? So when you change sin from acts or intentions to power, which they do, then all of a sudden only a certain group can be the sinner. And you see this in the politics around crime with different races. You see this in the politics of women, and this has infiltrated the church, and there has been definitely an attack on the masculine in the church. There's just no doubt. There is no doubt. The reaction has happened, and I've seen it. And there's a reason many churches don't have a lot of men.
Right.
There is.
Yeah, I've seen it in some, and I guess you could say the music and how we've curated the experience of church. It's definitely more appealing to the feminist.
Sure. It's very much an emotional experience. And Jordan Peterson came out, and by the way, I'm not endorsing Jordan Peterson here at all. I'm just saying
he's coming to Kelowna soon.
I heard they're going to protest him. He'll sell more tickets. That's the funny thing of these things. Eh?
Yeah.
Anyways,
good press for him.
Yeah, it is. And by the way, I'm not speaking against him either. But he did this thing about his advice for churches, and it was all about young men welcoming back. And he was dead right, by the way. There is nothing. There is this idea that we have to make men into kind of women to be good disciples. And that is absolutely wrong. But because the whole narrative is this idea that being male is oppressive, being female isn't. And it's influenced our schools.
Yeah.
I think young men in school have a really hard time. Most of their teachers are feminine, who've been taught by critical gender theory. There's a reason all this stuff happens.
Yeah, growing up as a little boy, it's like, you're bad, you're the problem.
100%.
Right?
And normal,
don't make that a gun, don't make that a sword. Don't fight.
Yeah.
You know,
it's testosterone is evil kind of thing.
Or like the idea of like women being strong is being more masculine, and the ideal man culture is more feminine. But
Well,
if you're in
and
your
yeah,
traditional roles,
100%.
you are offending culture. You're the problem.
Look what they did to Luke Skywalker in those movies. That's a classic example. If I can use a contemporary medium, he was in the early movies. He rescues the princess, right? He's young, brash. He's got all of the character development that needs to happen, and he becomes the hero. But he's not flawless, but he's not super flawed. And of course, you got Han Solo and all of that. By the time he gets into that movie of the new, he's this guy drinking blue animal milk, and he's grumbling, and he's just pathetic. And this young lady who doesn't need any character development just all of a sudden shows up, and she saves him, right? This is the whole, we need to change the whole narrative. And what that does, unfortunately, it's actually celebrating the curse. So I'll get into the theology a bit now. The reality is that Genesis, the creation narrative, discusses what's happening with the gender divide very well. You have humanity is created in God's image, male and female. You have this picture where there's human, and out of the side, it's not the rib. Like literally, as Ian Provan says, the word in Hebrew is torn in half, kind of thing.
Is that the same word that Solomon used?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I have to go ask Ian. He's coming out, but I think it is, if I remember. And out of this, we got a beep. Out of this came the male and female. So there is no inequality, as you see, and they're there to tend the garden. They've got a role and a job, and it's because man's not meant to be alone. And that's the picture of the ideal. And then, of course, they fall. They try and be like God. So now you've got the power dynamic immediately in. Idolatry comes in. We no longer have to be image bearers. We can create our own images. That's where idolatry comes in. And that's when the curse comes. And to the woman, he says, and he says to the woman, because she's the one that originally eats, he says, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And here's the main part. Your desire will be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. So you see in the curse that as a result of them trying to be gods, they're no longer going to have a harmonious relationship. She's going to try and control him. He's going to rule over her. So you see this sad reality of misogyny being told in the text, and it's part of the curse. And what we find in Scripture is God constantly dealing with cultures that are highly misogynistic, as you know. And that's because of the curse. That's the problem in ourselves. So
are you saying the Pharisees had debates about whether or not women had souls?
Yeah.
Like that's quite the culture.
Yeah,
I could imagine.
Pretty radical. And of course, women. I mean, by the time of Jesus, I'm not going to go through all of the Old Testament, but by the time of Jesus, women are, like the Pharisee said, every day they pray, thank God you didn't make me a Gentile. Thank God you didn't make me a woman. So you can tell the value. Women by that time are seen as little Jezebels, always up to tempt. That's why rabbis couldn't speak to them in public, because their nature was to allure people. I mean, it was awful. I mean, it was, and that's what makes the gospel so radical. I mean, you got this guy who comes into that world, sees what's going on, and he's there to restore the creation. He's there to save. He's there to renew. So it shouldn't surprise us that he radically changes the dynamics within his little disciple group of what a woman is. And you get people like Martha and Mary being praised, and you got, who's at the cross, right? The women. Mm-hmm. Who are the first witnesses? The women. These are radical things. I mean,
the first people Jesus spoke or presented himself to were
women. The women, that Syrophoenician woman, the woman at the well.
It's the first person he said he was the Messiah to was the woman at the well too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. See, these incredible stories, and it's so countercultural. So people who tell me, the disciples wrote this, they wouldn't have written it that way. They were lockstep. I always find it funny, when showing you what they thought of Mary Magdalene. They're at the tomb, and they see that it's empty, and they run out. They leave her there. They just leave her. Like, Like that was just,
maybe she couldn't keep up with them.
They thought they were grave robbers, right? No, and she just left there. They're no better. We know that the disciples are blind and deaf, just like we are, and it takes Christ coming back to bring this redemption, and the Holy Spirit doesn't just fall on men, right? It falls on humanity, and you begin this process of the undoing of the curse. So the ideal then becomes to undo the consequence of the curse. That's why I get very nervous when people tend to like to assign power roles in gender relations, because it doesn't seem to me to be the most effective thing to do if you're trying to undo the curse and bring things back.
So I think that scripture where it says, submit to one another, and wives submit to your husbands, lay your life down for your wife as Christ loved the church. How does that play into...
so I was going to go there. So great minds think alike. So most people were married in antiquity. So, but you can take the idea of gender roles there very well. It's not just in marriage, but we can extend that. But that's the microcosm. And of course, even in the Greco-Roman world, women were to submit to their husbands, and they could have multiple wives, right? Or multiple women, anyways. And that was just culturally accepted. Paul, I think, is writing Ephesians. It might be pseudographical by one of his disciples. There's debate on that. I think it is Paul, or it's a guy so Pauline that he's more Paul than Paul. Writes these instructions, and the first thing he does is he gives instructions to the wife to submit, which that culturally would be accepted. There's nothing radical there. But this is where the cross comes in. The cross comes in to undo it, but not by gaining power. He wasn't saying that so that the man could have power. So he flips it then to the cruciform life. And he notes to the man, so how he undoes the culture is not by destroying cultural ideals, by turning them on their head. So he says to the man what no one is saying in antiquity, which is love your wife like Christ loves the church, which is to die for. So now what you have is back to this idea of power gets destroyed by the cross. Because the cross destroys it. We're all laid bare, right? And a relationship then that is based on power can only be undone once we begin to think of treating another person like Jesus. So he treats the women like valuable image bearers. He dies for them. And that becomes then the principle he wants the church to carry. Now, there are other texts. I know women don't speak in Corinthians. You can look at my sermon online. That's not what people think it is. There are some tough texts about teaching and leadership, and I'm not going to deny they're tough, but again, I'm going by the larger, I'm interpreting by the larger hermeneutic of the creation narrative.
You mentioned leading like Jesus, and I can't help but think of like the foot washing, like Jesus getting down on his feet or on his hands or his knees and washing the disciples' feet, and going on to say we don't lord our authority over each other like the Gentiles do, but this is what it looks like to serve. So leading like Jesus in that sense in your family.
Yeah, and so family interactions are supposed to be cruciform. And by the way, it's the one part in Ephesians he talks about children obeying their parents, but he also says parents don't be harsh. That never has happened in antiquity, by the way. You see this cruciform in the whole relationships. We see it in Philemon when I think it's Onesimus is the slave who runs away. So literally he could be crucified for that. But what Paul does is he says, yes, he is your slave. You have those rights, but he's also your brother. You see, and he changes the natural dynamics, treat him like a brother. So how does Paul want to undo slavery? Not through laws, but through our hearts. The inequity. And that's the difference that's going on here. So what happens though, and I can give you now an example. There's a lady that was a minister. Her name was Karen McCandless Davis. The reason I'm mentioning her is because she's got a public platform and she should be exposed. And her story was such that she was married to another minister. They went to that school that told you weren't supposed to worship Jesus because he's a man.
Oh.
And they were before my time. I don't know what they got. But anyways, they had been kind of evangelical. Then they got liberal. They became woke. And
they saw the light.
Yeah. And what was sad too is and I'm sure this all happened because I met the guy and I don't have a lot of time for him. He popped her around like he did. He threw her against some doors and it was bad. You know what I mean? And so she got involved in, at least that's their story, they tell. Then she gets involved and she becomes really enamored with this critical gender theory and tries to apply it to the church. So now she takes him around. He stayed with her, of all things. And of course, she got her piece of flesh because she publicly, every 5 minutes, was lambasting this guy. It's not a healthy thing. And then you got this woman going around, and then she started this women's counseling. Okay, so now you take that gender theory, and she actually said this to a peer of mine, that women can't sin because she's looking at it as a power thing.
So
right,
like the protected class.
So the church said, "Oh, let's send our women who are." We all know we all have marriage problem. Everybody who's been married for 5 minutes, except for you. I know you're.
No, I've arrived. Just don't ask my wife.
That's right. So her concept was that, and I saw marriages destroyed because she would go and convince these women that the man is the problem, right? Which I'm sure some of them were, and probably some were abusive and they should have got out. But the answer wasn't, the answer is, first of all, who are we in Christ? You know, how can we work this out? When you start, like, I mean, all of a sudden, I have met two of the people whose marriages were destroyed because of this woman. And they were told that because they sped too fast, they were abusing, or they raised their voice, or do you see what I mean? Because every action now is an action of power. And so she goes around, and this is her shtick, and she goes into the church, and that's what scares me, because she's destroying. Now, I want you to hear this out. If a guy hits his wife, he's doing porneia. Porneia is the Greek word that we translate adultery, and of course it's been defined, but it's a covenant word. Okay, definitely includes sexual immorality. It's where we got pornography from, the word, but it isn't just that. When the Jews are worshiping the false gods, he says you're committing adultery with me, with the gods.
Breaking covenant.
Breaking covenant, right? So that's that same word in the Septuagint. So clearly when Jesus says, unless somebody commits porneia, and obviously beating up your wife or your husband, if the case may be, is an act of porneia. You need serious help, and that is an act that you can definitely end. And we should grieve it, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, marriage is a beautiful picture because it is back to the creation, isn't it? It made in God's image. It's not good for man to be alone. I'm not saying you're not an image bearer if you're not in a marriage. Be careful when I say this. But I think it's an opportunity where we get to see these two components. And I'm going to tell you from my personal experience, my 17-year marriage with Anne has been wonderful because you see how this can work. And so, yeah, she creates this mythology in these people's heads, and then of course they leave, they take the kids, and it's always an acrimonious divorce because he's now become the evil one, right?
So like in an ideal marriage, it's like two people daily choosing to love each other despite your challenges, your imperfections, and like I can speak for myself.
And you're both sinners. Yeah. That's the key.
Like you feel really loved when somebody chooses to love you in your imperfection. You're like, wow,
like
that is meaningful.
I truly believe that confession should be, this is my reformed, confession should be a major part of our marriages because we are sinful. We are. I do judge and I do all kinds of stupid things. No, I'm not cheating and I'm not beating my wife or any of those things, but we definitely, I'm not sensitive and I don't love her like Christ loves the church at times, and I'm disappointed in myself more than anyone else. What a gift the cross is, eh? We can both come, and that's what keeps us going, because she's not perfect either. I mean, that's the thing I'll tell you, young people, if you're going to think you're meeting a prince or a princess, I'm going to tell you you're not.
You just have to find Mr. Right.
That's right.
Just the person that makes you feel
good.
We'll
have an episode on that, and I'll tell you what, I'll get ranting.
Your soulmate, you just need to find
nowadays it's just right now, Mr. Right Now, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's swipe left or right.
It has changed, Jason. We're old now compared to what... I mean, but feminism hasn't helped that either, because they're telling them that to find yourself is to be sexually free. That's the Freud component, right? And how many women have I ran into who are absolutely, who've come into the church, repented, and said those were the darkest moments of their life. Men too, by the way.
Yeah. Well, isn't it 4 or 5% of guys that get most women on Tinder and whatnot? And you get that type of chauvinistic person, and then their
100%.
interpretation
100%.
of what man is in culture is of that 4 or 5%.
Yeah, it's not Christ loving his church.
I heard a lady or a woman sharing her story of Tinder hookup, and after they finish their experience, he's already like laying next to her in bed looking for the next hookup that night.
That's insane.
And she's like,
oh, you can hear those stories, eh?
Yeah, and
yeah, I mean, I knew a girl who got involved, and see this. Bringing it back to Christianity is Christianity actually has the answer for gender. If a couple comes in, that yes, you may have to say this is done. You know, it does happen, and it's heartbreaking. Porneas happen. Like if they would have come into my office and he had popped her around the room a few times, I'm like, get away from this guy. Mm-hmm. He's clearly got issues. And then I'd also love him. I would. I'd say, you know what?
You lay hands and feet on
him.
I
know. Yeah, no, but there's a truth. Like he's obviously very damaged, but I'm still called to love the sinner, right? Yeah. But that's a completely different way of looking at people and people made in God's image. And obviously she's very damaged from that, and she's using that damage to lash out. Unfortunately, the church has allowed it, and the church should have come up and said, "No way, you're done." But it is what it is. But that's why I speak on this, is because the pastor in me wants to see, and I'm thrilled that people can know here that we have female elders here and we got male elders, and it has been a blessing. I've been doing it for 20 years. No, they're not in the roles of elders in the Timothy, because we just don't have elders that work in that kind of way. Maybe more like deacons, but the truth is, it's been an invaluable thing, and we would not have had the health of our church without female elders. So I see it really as the two image bearers coming together and glorifying God, and that's been my experience. Sure, there's some differences. Isn't that wonderful? Men are different from women, like that.
Very different perspective, especially in the leadership.
You've been in a few of the meetings. You can see, but it's helpful. Like it's made me consider things, and I'm thankful for it. But I also don't think we have to put men down to get them there, and that's the other side. I think that the answer is the cross, right? And it's always the cross. And feminism, contemporary feminism, like contemporary race relations, is not the answer. It's not the gospel. And if people hold it, they need to be saved. I can't be more clear that it's based on the curse, okay? Just like misogyny, by the way. If you're holding so hear me out. If you're holding to either of these perspectives in such a way that you see everything through balance, you are living the curse, and you will have the fruit of the curse, and the ultimate curse is destruction for Adam. So there's my warning.
Everything through balance, like what do you mean by that?
Well, we need to recognize that, how do you mean that?
So like you're saying, like if you're a man trying to dominate a woman, that's the curse, and a woman trying to dominate a man, that's the curse. But ideally, we want to complement one another, be in unity as male and female,
and really to sacrifice. And that doesn't mean just like, obviously the microcosm is a potentially a marriage relationship, but that should be us in how we interact. You know, love each other, honor each other, love one another. Tolerate. That's a thing that we don't do in our culture. And when a man comes in and he's your typical male, driving his big truck and likes to go hunting and stuff, he needs to be as welcome and realize that Christ made him as much as the female. I can't emphasize that enough. They need to feel accepted and realize that Jesus Christ made them in his image. Yeah. And some of the cultural things are silly. We can agree with that. But as they walk with Christ, they're not going to become more feminine. They're going to be their true self, and some of that will be let go. Same with women. And if you have a feminine man, more effeminate, or a masculine woman, they're all welcome. They're creating God's image.
Yeah,
and that's okay. But we cannot celebrate division. That's the key, and because it does destroy marriages. It really does. It destroys relationships. It destroys churches. I was asked once, should women be pastors? And you know my view. But I said many of them shouldn't, because they've got this bent. Just like you shouldn't go into the pastor if you hate women. Yeah. Right? And they say, we don't hate men. Well, you kind of do, because you just said...
Kind of demeaning.
You just said they're the ones that are the power, right? Like, you really do. And,
I heard someone say once that... I'm egalitarian because I'm complementarian, and they were
What does that all mean?
they're saying like
Those words are. I hear those words. What
yeah, well, complementarian is like egalitarian is like equality in relationship, and egalitarian, and then complementarian is one complements one another. Anyways, what they were saying is that
You should get your mic closer. I can hear it.
yeah, they're saying that essentially because my wife is gifted in a certain area, I allow her to operate in her giftedness. If that's
I allow her. There you
yeah,
go.
or compliment her and her create space for her. I allow yeah.
Okay, well, I guess what I'm saying is
What they were trying to say is that I am supporting my wife in how God has designed her to operate.
Sounds really nice. I'm getting a little nervous about the power.
Yeah.
But hey, if that works,
I think they.
I
bring it up in the sense
because I get hit.
Because they're two ideologies that have been conflicting to each other, and this guy was trying to tie the idea together. Serving your wife is helping her in her giftedness. Like I know a couple who, the wife is a great speaker, and he's not.
Yeah.
And he helps her on her engagements and supports her as best he can in that, and I think they have a really good marriage.
Well, and, I think that's the reality. Is there's also giftedness. So my dad is the banker in our family. My mom cannot do that. That's just not her gift.
Yeah.
I can't do it either. So who does our banking? It's my wife. Now, some people would say that's a traditional male role, but we love each other. We care for each other. We lift each other up, and that's the key. The text, and you can figure out a lot. I imagine if a man really loved his wife like Christ loved the church, she wouldn't mind submitting. That's what I'd imagine.
That's a heavy word right there, submit.
I know, trust me. Whenever I say it at home, I get whacked.
The spatula comes out?
Yeah, that's right. That's an in-joke, by the way. I really, anyways. And that's the other thing. These people, they can't laugh at it themselves. So we laugh about this stuff, and we don't obviously make light of serious abuse, but
it's nice to be able to laugh and
we do.
not
we
take
laugh
yourself
at
too
ourselves,
seriously.
and we laugh at the culture, and we laugh at the silliness going on, and that's a really healthy part of our marriage, I think. Yeah, and I got to tell you, I really do love my wife, and I'm really honored to have her as my wife, and I want to love her more, like Christ loves the church, because His Spirit is in me.
Shout out to moms for Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes, and I really do value women. I want to be careful because we say something, but I really, really do. Yeah. And I value them for being women, and that's why and we'll get into the transgender thing. That's why I'm horrified by that movement. It's really erasing what it means. That's such an act of misogyny.
Or toxic masculinity right there. Yeah, I'm just going to dominate women's sports now, okay?
It's stunning. And the fact women aren't saying more, like some are, of course. It's stunning.
Or like the Woman of the Year being a man? Or sorry,
I know.
Once was, can you say that? I guess I don't even know.
You gotta be careful with words, right? So,
the whole
demeaning. But it's sad too because it's just like the women who have a bad marriage and then they go see that lady. They get the bad advice. So these people are struggling with gender dysphoria. Is it dysphoria? Is that how?
Gender dysphoria. Yeah.
I think that's how it is.
Yeah.
They're not getting the help. They're being encouraged in this mental health, and it's really sad. But again, let's end on a positive. The fact is that on that day, when we will all get into new creation, that's what He calls us, new creation. He's going back to the garden, right? We won't have this conflict, and there will be men, and there'll be different races, and it will be a time where this stuff ends. And the question is whether you want to be in that or not is how you see it now. And if you can only see conflict, again, I can't say this enough, you need to be saved. You need to encounter Christ on the cross, because you're not a Christian if you're celebrating this. I can't be more clear on that. And I know that's offensive, but so
at least you've acknowledged your microaggressions or your checked your privilege here
towards you.
Yeah. I feel threatened right now.
I'm going to read this text, Candace, because I think that should be our theme. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil.
Awesome.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, Emery.